The dust-coated stagecoach rattled to a stop outside Wallace, Idaho, in the summer of 1878, carrying Katherine Rose and the shattered remains of her decade-long dream. As the wheels settled in the dirt of Main Street, the finality of Dr. Henderson's words in Denver still echoed through her mind. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rose, but there is absolutely no possibility you will ever bear children." Katherine smoothed the wrinkles from her navy traveling dress as the driver opened the door. The journey from Denver had been long, but her husband's telegram had been clear: their new life awaited in the mining town of Wallace. 10 years of marriage to Edward Rose had brought her to this remote corner of Idaho territory, where silver strikes promised fortunes and new beginnings. But for Katherine, at 32 years of age, it felt like an ending. Mrs. Rose, a young boy no more than 12, stood before her, cap in hand. "Mr. Evans at the Mercantile said to watch for you. I'm to take your bags to your new house." Katherine nodded, forcing a smile as the driver unloaded her trunks. "Thank you, young man." The boy loaded her belongings onto a small cart. "Your husband bought the old Peterson place. It's just down Cedar Street, not far." Katherine followed in silence, taking in the rough-hewn town that would now be her home. Wallace was a patchwork of wooden buildings with false fronts, muddy streets, and the constant backdrop of forested mountains. Men in dusty work clothes moved purposefully between saloons and storefronts, while the occasional woman hurried along the boardwalks with baskets or children in tow. Children. Katherine felt the familiar ache in her chest. The Peterson place turned out to be a modest 2-story house with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. It sat at the edge of town where civilization gave way to wilderness, a fitting metaphor for Katherine's current state of mind. A note pinned to the door informed her that Edward had been called to the mines unexpectedly and would return by nightfall. "Will there be anything else, madam?" the boy asked after depositing her trunks in the empty parlor. Katherine pressed a coin into his palm. "No, thank you. You've been most helpful." Alone in the silent house, Katherine moved from room to room. The furniture was sparse. Edward had written that he'd purchased only the essentials. She trailed her fingertips over the rough wooden table in the kitchen, the iron stove, the empty shelves. In the small bedroom upstairs, she found a bed and dresser, but it was the second bedroom that stopped her cold. Empty. Waiting. A room that would never know a child's laughter. Katherine sank onto the floor, her skirts billowing around her, and finally allowed herself the tears she had held back since Denver. 10 years of hoping, of monthly disappointments, of remedies and doctors and prayers. 10 years watching other women's bellies swell with life while her own remained stubbornly flat. And now, the final verdict: there would be no miracle, no late blessing. She was barren, useless. The sound of approaching hoofbeats roused her from her grief. Quickly wiping her tears, she moved to the window. But it wasn't Edward approaching, it was a stranger, a tall man on a chestnut horse. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle, tying his horse to the porch railing before climbing the steps and knocking firmly on the door. Katherine hesitated, then straightened her dress and descended the stairs. She opened the door just enough to see the visitor, a man perhaps in his late 30s, with sun-weathered skin and startling blue eyes beneath the brim of a worn Stetson. He removed his hat immediately, revealing dark blonde hair streaked with lighter strands from the sun. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and respectful, "I'm Yates Jackson. I run the Circle J ranch outside of town. Your husband asked me to check on you when you arrived." "Mr. Jackson," Katherine acknowledged with a nod. "I'm Katherine Rose. My husband mentioned you in his letters. He spoke highly of your assistance in finding us this property." "Just doing what neighbors do, Mrs. Rose," he replied. "Edward's been working hard at the mine. He's a determined man." Katherine noticed the way the man's eyes took in her tear-stained face without comment. There was something kind in his assessment, something that made her feel less exposed than she should have. "May I offer you some refreshment, Mr. Jackson?" she asked, remembering her manners despite her emotional state. "Though I'm afraid I haven't yet unpacked any provisions," he smiled, revealing a slight dimple in his left cheek. "That's why I'm here, Mrs. Rose. I've brought you some supplies to tide you over." He gestured to his saddlebags. "And please, most folks around here just call me Yates." Katherine felt an unexpected warmth at this simple kindness. "Then you must call me Katherine." She stepped back, allowing him entry into the house. As he brought in provisions, flour, coffee, dried beans, bacon, and a jar of preserves, Katherine found herself studying him. Unlike the miners and townsmen she'd glimpsed, Yates Jackson carried himself with quiet confidence. His clothes were practical but clean denims, a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal tanned forearms, and a leather vest. A holstered pistol hung at his hip, but somehow it seemed more a tool than a weapon. "Your husband mentioned you were coming from Denver," Yates said as he placed the supplies on the kitchen counter. "That's quite a journey." "Yes," Katherine replied softly. "I was visiting a specialist there." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, for Yates looked at her with unexpected understanding. "I hope you're in good health, Mrs. Rose." "Perfect health, actually," she said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "Perfectly healthy and perfectly barren." The words hung in the air between them. Katherine immediately regretted her candor. Such personal matters weren't discussed with strangers, especially men. But the isolation of the past weeks, carrying her diagnosis alone, had weakened her usual restraint. "I apologize, Mr. Jackson. That was inappropriate of me." Yates shook his head slowly. "No need for apologies, Katherine. Life out here isn't kind to secrets or pretense. We all carry our burdens, some are just more visible than others." Before she could respond, the front door opened, and Edward Rose entered, his clothes dusty from the mines. He was a handsome man with brown hair and earnest eyes, though the past years had etched lines of worry around his mouth that hadn't been there when they wed. "Katherine." Edward crossed the room in 3 strides, embracing her tightly before holding her at arm's length to examine her. "You've arrived safely. Thank God." He turned to Yates with a grateful smile. "And I see Yates has been looking after you. Thank you, friend." "Just being neighborly," Yates replied, reaching for his hat. "I should be heading back to the ranch. There's plenty of daylight left for work." Edward insisted on walking him out, and Katherine watched from the window as the 2 men spoke briefly on the porch. There was something in Yates Jackson's posture, a straightness of the spine, a steadiness that spoke of reliability. As he mounted his horse and rode away, Katherine found herself wondering about the ranch he'd mentioned and the life he led there. That evening, as she and Edward ate a simple supper at their new table, she recounted her visit to the specialist in Denver. Edward's face fell with each word, his fork eventually landing on his plate with a clatter. "So there's no hope," he said finally, his voice hollow. "None at all." "That's what the doctor said," Katherine confirmed, studying her husband's face. "Edward, I'm so sorry. I know how much you wanted children. He corrected, reaching for her hand across the table. "How much we wanted children. This affects us both, Katherine." But as she looked into his eyes, Katherine could see the depth of his disappointment. Edward came from a large family. He'd always spoken of having many children. It had been their shared dream until month after month, year after year, that dream had faded into a desperate hope and now into nothingness. "What will we do now?" she asked, voicing the question that had haunted her since Denver. Edward squeezed her hand. "We'll build our life here. The Silver Valley is booming. I've secured a good position at the mine, and in time I might be able to invest in a claim of my own. But without children—" The words stuck in her throat. "There are other ways to find purpose," Edward said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll find our way." That night, lying beside her sleeping husband in their new bedroom, Katherine stared at the ceiling, feeling more alone than she ever had. She'd failed at the one thing that defined a woman's worth. What use was she now? What purpose could her life possibly have? The next morning, Edward left before dawn for the mine. Katherine spent the day unpacking their belongings and attempting to make the house feel like home. By afternoon, the walls seemed to be closing in on her, and she decided to venture into town for additional supplies. Wallace was bustling with activity. The mercantile was crowded with miners, ranchers, and townspeople. Katherine selected her items carefully, mindful of their limited budget. As the shopkeeper tallied her purchases, the bell above the door jangled and Yates Jackson entered, nodding politely to those he passed. "Mrs. Rose," he said, tipping his hat when he spotted her. "Settling in all right, as well as can be expected," she replied. "It's quite different from Pennsylvania." "I imagine so. Took me some time to adjust when I came out from Kentucky 15 years ago." He glanced at her purchases. "That's a lot to carry back to Cedar Street. May I offer you a ride?" Katherine hesitated. In Pennsylvania, such an offer might have raised eyebrows, but here in Wallace, the usual social strictures seemed more relaxed. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. That's very kind." Outside, Yates helped her into his wagon before loading her purchases in the back. As they drove through town, he pointed out buildings of interest: the assay office, the new schoolhouse being constructed, the doctor's residence. "Dr. Whitman's a good man," Yates said, nodding toward a white clapboard house. "Came out here 5 years ago. Lost his wife to influenza back east and decided to start fresh. He's been a blessing to the community." "It seems everyone here has a story," Katherine observed. "Everyone everywhere has a story," Yates replied. "Out here, we're just more honest about the chapters that hurt." The wagon rolled past the last buildings of town and turned onto Cedar Street. Katherine found herself reluctant for the short journey to end. There was something comforting about Yates Jackson's presence, a steadiness that made her feel less adrift. "Mr. Jackson," she said suddenly, "may I ask you a personal question?" He glanced at her, his expression open. "You can ask. I might even answer. You have a family, children." A shadow crossed his face so briefly she almost missed it. "No, madam, never married." "May I ask why not?" He was quiet for a moment, considering her question as the wagon wheels creaked beneath them. "I suppose because the right circumstance never arose. I came west young, built my ranch from nothing. By the time I looked up, I was 35 with calloused hands and not much to offer a lady beyond a hard life on a growing spread." "That seems like plenty to offer," Katherine said softly. Yates pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her house. "Kind of you to say." He helped her down, his hands strong and sure around her waist. "Truth is, Katherine, most folks want the same basic things: to love and be loved, to build something that lasts beyond themselves. Some find it in family, some in work, some in other ways entirely." For a moment, their eyes met, and Katherine felt a strange connection, as if this man somehow understood the hollow ache inside her. "I should get these supplies inside," she said, breaking the moment. "Of course." Yates began unloading her purchases. "I'll be driving into town again on Saturday if you need anything." After he left, Katherine stood on her porch watching his wagon disappear down the road. There was something about Yates Jackson that intrigued her. Perhaps it was his self-sufficiency or the quiet wisdom in his eyes. Whatever it was, she found herself looking forward to Saturday, even as guilt pricked at her conscience for thinking so much about another man. The week passed slowly. Edward returned each evening exhausted, his clothes stained with the evidence of his labor. He spoke enthusiastically about the mine, the men he worked with, the potential for advancement. Katherine listened and tried to share his optimism, but her mind repeatedly drifted to her barrenness and what it meant for their future. On Friday evening, Edward arrived home with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you," he said, his eyes alight with excitement. "Open it." Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal with creamy blank pages. "I thought you might use it to record our new beginning," Edward explained, "and perhaps to write down those stories you used to tell." Katherine ran her fingers over the smooth leather. Before their marriage, she had aspired to write children's stories. That dream, like so many others, had been set aside in the pursuit of motherhood. "Thank you, Edward," she said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect." He smiled, pleased with her reaction. "I have more news. The mine superintendent has invited us to supper tomorrow at his home. It's an opportunity to meet some of the important people in town." "Tomorrow?" Katherine's heart sank. "I was planning to go into town for supplies." "We can do that another time," Edward said dismissively. "This invitation is significant, Katherine. The superintendent doesn't extend such offers lightly." Katherine nodded, swallowing her disappointment. "Of course. I'll prepare my blue dress." Saturday arrived bright and clear. Katherine spent the morning cleaning the house and the afternoon preparing for the evening's engagement. As she pinned her dark hair into an elegant chignon, she found herself wondering if Yates Jackson had driven into town as planned, if he'd thought about her at all when she wasn't there. The superintendent's house was the grandest in Wallace, a 2-story Victorian with gingerbread trim and actual glass windows. Inside, it was furnished with pieces that must have been shipped at great expense from the East. Mrs. Sullivan, the superintendent's wife, was a formidable woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Rose," she said, appraising Katherine's blue silk dress. "How lovely to meet you. We've heard much about you from your husband." "All good, I hope," Katherine replied with a polite smile. "Indeed, though I understand you've only just arrived from Denver." Mrs. Sullivan lowered her voice. "I heard you were consulting specialists there. I do hope everything is all right with your health." Katherine felt her face flush. Had Edward discussed their private matters with his employer? "My health is excellent, thank you," she said stiffly. "Oh, I'm so relieved," Mrs. Sullivan continued, oblivious to Katherine's discomfort. "Children are such a blessing after all. My Robert and I have 5, though only our youngest is still at home." Before Katherine could respond, Edward appeared at her side, steering her toward a group of men discussing mining operations. The evening proceeded with tedious conversation about silver prices, extraction methods, and local politics. Katherine smiled and nodded in all the right places, but inside, she felt increasingly hollow. On the walk home, Edward was animated, recounting conversations and connections made. "The superintendent was impressed, Katherine. He specifically mentioned how well you conducted yourself." "Did you tell him?" Katherine asked abruptly. "About Denver, about my condition." Edward's pace faltered. "I may have mentioned to Sullivan that we'd been hoping for children." "It came up naturally in conversation." "It came up naturally," Katherine repeated, her voice tight. "So now the entire town will know that I'm barren." "Katherine, that's unfair. Sullivan isn't a gossip." "His wife certainly is," she countered. "She practically interrogated me about it this evening." Edward sighed. "I'm sorry. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't," Katherine interrupted, tears threatening. "You didn't think about how it would feel for me to have my failure as a woman become common knowledge." "Katherine, stop." Edward grabbed her arm, turning her to face him. "You have not failed, and you are not defined by your ability to bear children." "Aren't I?" she challenged. "What purpose do I serve otherwise? What value do I have?" Edward's face softened. "You're my wife, I love you, that's your value." But as they continued home in silence, Katherine couldn't help but notice that Edward hadn't answered her question about purpose. Because the truth was, in this rugged territory where survival itself was a daily achievement, she had no idea what her purpose might be now that motherhood was forever beyond her reach. Sunday morning arrived with a gentle rain pattering against the roof. Edward suggested they attend services at the small church in town, but Katherine begged off, claiming a headache. In truth, she couldn't bear the thought of facing the townspeople, imagining their pitying glances and whispered speculations. After Edward left, Katherine sat at the kitchen table with the journal he had given her. She opened it to the first blank page and stared at it for a long time before finally dipping her pen in ink. "Today, I begin a new life in Wallace, Idaho," she wrote. "A life without the children I always dreamed of, a life without purpose." She paused, then continued, "I don't know who I am anymore." A knock at the door startled her. She closed the journal quickly and went to answer, expecting perhaps a neighbor paying a courtesy call. Instead, she found Yates Jackson on her porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Mr. Jackson," she said, surprised, "I didn't expect to see you today." "I was concerned when you didn't come to town yesterday," he explained. "Wanted to make sure everything was all right." Katherine was touched by his thoughtfulness. "We had a supper engagement with my husband's employer. Please come in out of the rain." Yates removed his hat and coat, hanging them by the door. "I won't stay long. Your husband at church?" "Yes," Katherine confirmed, moving to the stove. "May I offer you coffee?" "That would be welcome, thank you." They sat at the kitchen table as rain drummed against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy in the small house. Katherine found herself telling Yates about the previous evening at the superintendent's home, about Mrs. Sullivan's probing questions, and about her argument with Edward afterward. "Now the whole town will know," she concluded, staring into her coffee cup. "They'll all look at me and see only what I lack." Yates was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "People will talk," he finally agreed. "That's the nature of small towns, but they'll soon find something else to occupy their gossip." "That doesn't change the fact that I've failed at the one thing expected of me," Katherine said bitterly. "What purpose does a barren woman serve?" "Purpose," Yates repeated thoughtfully. "That's a heavy word, Katherine, and a dangerous one if we let others define it for us." "What do you mean?" "I mean that purpose isn't something assigned at birth based on whether you're a man or woman. It's something you discover, sometimes in unexpected places." He leaned forward, his blue eyes intent. "Hope isn't about having children, Katherine. It's about finding meaning in the life you have, not the one you thought you'd have." His words struck her with unexpected force. "Is that what you've done? Found meaning in unexpected places?" A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I came west thinking I'd strike it rich in gold or silver. Instead, I found my peace in raising cattle and horses, not the life I planned, but one I wouldn't trade now." They talked for nearly an hour. Yates told her about his ranch, about the challenges and satisfactions of building something from nothing. Katherine found herself sharing stories from her childhood in Pennsylvania, her dreams of writing, her early years with Edward before the pressure to conceive had overshadowed everything else. When Yates finally rose to leave, Katherine felt lighter than she had in months. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? for seeing me," she replied. "Not just as a woman who can't have children, but as me." Yates studied her face for a moment. "You're worth seeing, Katherine Rose." He donned his hat and coat. "I'm hosting a small gathering at my ranch next Saturday. Nothing formal, just neighbors and friends. You and Edward would be welcome." After he left, Katherine returned to her journal and crossed out her earlier entry. Beneath it, she wrote, "Today I was reminded that life doesn't end with one dream. Perhaps it's time to discover new ones." Throughout the following week, Katherine found herself thinking often of Yates's words about purpose and hope. She began exploring Wallace more thoroughly, introducing herself to shopkeepers and neighbors. At the mercantile, she overheard the schoolteacher lamenting the lack of books for the children. "The new schoolhouse will be finished soon," the young woman was saying, "but we have so few resources." Katherine found herself stepping forward. "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing. I have some experience with children's literature. Perhaps I could help." The teacher, Miss Abigail Jenkins, brightened immediately. "Oh, Mrs. Rose, that would be wonderful. Do you have teaching experience?" "No," Katherine admitted, "but I've written stories for children, though never published, and I have a collection of books from back east that I'd be happy to donate." By the end of their conversation, Katherine had agreed to visit the temporary schoolroom the following day. Walking home, she felt a flutter of excitement that had been absent for so long. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to use her love for children even if she couldn't have her own. That evening, she told Edward about her encounter with Miss Jenkins and her offer to help at the school. "That sounds like an excellent idea," Edward said, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. "You always did have a way with words." "Yates Jackson said something that's been on my mind," Katherine said carefully, "about finding purpose in unexpected places." Edward's expression shifted slightly. "You've been speaking with Jackson again. He called on Sunday while you were at church," Katherine explained. "Just being neighborly. In fact, he's invited us to a gathering at his ranch this Saturday." Edward was quiet for a moment. "I've heard good things about Jackson's ranch. It would be a chance to meet more people in the area." He paused. "You seem different today, more like your old self." Katherine realized he was right. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of possibility. "I think perhaps I've been too focused on what I can't have, instead of what I might still do." Edward reached across the table for her hand. "I want you to be happy, Katherine. That's all I've ever wanted." The next day, Katherine visited the schoolroom, a cramped space above the mercantile that served the town's children until the new building was completed. 20 pairs of curious eyes turned to her as Miss Jenkins introduced her. "Mrs. Rose has kindly offered to share stories with us," the teacher announced. "She's come all the way from Pennsylvania and brings with her tales from the East." Katherine had brought one of her own stories, written years ago about a rabbit who longed to see the ocean. As she read aloud, watching the children's faces light up with imagination, something shifted inside her. Here was joy. Here was purpose. After the lesson, she helped Miss Jenkins organize the meager supply of books. "You have a gift," the teacher told her. The children were spellbound. "It felt wonderful," Katherine admitted. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed this." "We desperately need someone to help establish a proper library for the school," Miss Jenkins said. "If you're truly interested, I could speak with the school board." By Friday, Katherine had visited the schoolroom 3 times and agreed to head a committee to establish a library for Wallace's children. She had also begun writing again. The journal Edward gave her now filled with story ideas and character sketches. Saturday arrived clear and bright. Edward had agreed to attend Yates's gathering, though Katherine sensed a reluctance in him that she couldn't quite understand. They borrowed a buggy from a neighbor and followed the directions Yates had provided. heading north out of Wallace along a well-maintained road that eventually gave way to a narrower track, winding through pine forests. The Circle J Ranch appeared suddenly. As they emerged from the trees, a sprawling property nestled in a verdant valley with mountains rising on three sides. A large two-story log house stood at the center, surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures where cattle and horses grazed. Several wagons and horses were already tethered near the house. Yates greeted them as they approached, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "Edward, Katherine, welcome to Circle J." He led them toward the house, introducing them to neighbors and ranch hands along the way. The gathering was larger than Katherine had expected, with perhaps 30 people scattered across the property. A long table on the porch held an abundance of food, and somewhere, a fiddle was being tuned. "Your ranch is impressive," Edward commented, looking around with evident respect. "How many acres?" 2,000, Yates replied. "Started with just 115 years ago." Edward whistled appreciatively. "You've built something substantial here." "It's been my life's work," Yates acknowledged. "Come, let me show you around while Katherine gets acquainted with some of the ladies." As the men walked toward the barn, Katherine found herself drawn into conversation with a group of women ranging in age from early 20s to well into their 60s. Most were wives of neighboring ranchers or townspeople, though a few, like Sarah Miller, ran their own properties. "Took over my husband's farm when he died of pneumonia 6 years back," Sarah explained, a capable-looking woman in her 40s. "Folks thought I'd sell up and head back east, but this is home now." "That must have been challenging," Katherine said. Sarah shrugged. "Life is challenging. We adapt or we perish. Simple as that." Throughout the afternoon, Katherine moved among the guests, finding herself more at ease than she had been at the superintendent's formal supper. These were practical, hardworking people who valued straightforwardness over pretense. No one asked probing questions about children or family planning. They were more interested in her impressions of Wallace and her work with the school. As the sun began to set, casting the valley in golden light, tables were cleared for dancing. The single fiddle had been joined by a guitar and banjo, and the musicians struck up a lively tune that brought couples to the cleared space in front of the porch. Edward, who had spent most of the afternoon in conversation with Yates and other ranchers, appeared at Katherine's side. "Shall we dance, Mrs. Rose?" Katherine accepted his hand with a smile, allowing him to lead her into the improvised dance floor. As they moved through the steps of a familiar reel, she caught glimpses of Yates watching from the edge of the gathering, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Later, as lanterns were lit around the property and the dancing continued, Katherine found herself momentarily alone on the porch, catching her breath after a particularly energetic dance. Yates approached, offering a cup of water. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked. "Very much," she replied honestly. "Your home is beautiful, Yates. Taken a lot of years and work," he said, leaning against the porch railing beside her, "but worth every callus and sunburn." He nodded toward the dancers, where Edward was now partnered with Sarah Miller for a Virginia reel. "Your husband's made quite an impression. Been asking good questions about ranching operations." "Has he?" Katherine was surprised. Edward had never expressed interest in ranching before. "Said he's reconsidering his options," Yates continued. "Mining's profitable but dangerous work. Not sure it's where he sees his future." Before Katherine could respond, Edward returned, slightly out of breath from dancing. "Katherine, you should see the view from the rise behind the house. Yates says you can see the whole valley from there." The three of them walked together up a gentle slope behind the main house. The night was clear, with a half moon providing enough light to see by. From the top of the rise, the valley spread before them, the lanterns from the party twinkling like earthbound stars. "It's breathtaking," Katherine murmured. "Best view in Idaho territory," Yates agreed. "I come up here sometimes just to remind myself why all the work is worthwhile." Edward was quiet, looking out over the valley with an expression Katherine couldn't quite read. Finally, he spoke. "You've built something remarkable here, Jackson." "Thank you," Yates replied simply. "Though I can't take all the credit. Land like this does half the work if you listen to what it needs." As they stood in companionable silence, Katherine felt a curious sense of rightness, as if the three of them belonged in this moment together. It was a strange feeling, one she couldn't quite understand but found herself cherishing nonetheless. The gathering continued late into the night. When Katherine and Edward finally took their leave, Yates walked them to their buggy. "You're welcome at Circle J anytime," he told them. "Both of you." On the drive back to Wallace, Edward was unusually quiet. Katherine, still buoyed by the evening's festivities, finally broke the silence. "You seem to enjoy yourself tonight." "I did," Edward admitted. "Jackson's assembled quite an operation, and his neighbors respect him." "He's built something meaningful," Katherine observed. "Yes." Edward was quiet for another moment, then added, "I've been thinking, Katherine, about our future here." "What about it?" "The mines are profitable, but it's brutal work. Men are broken by it if they're lucky enough to avoid accidents." He glanced at her in the moonlight. "I'm not sure it's the legacy I want." "What are you saying, Edward?" He took a deep breath. "I'm saying that perhaps there are other opportunities here. Land is still available in the valley. With some investment and hard work." "You want to ranch?" Katherine was stunned. "You've never mentioned such a thing before." "I never considered it before," Edward acknowledged. "But seeing Jackson's place, talking with him and the others, I don't know, it stirred something in me." Katherine considered this revelation as the buggy rattled down the moonlit road. "It would be a completely different life than what we planned." "We've already been given a completely different life than what we planned," Edward said softly. "Maybe it's time we embrace that fact." The next morning, instead of attending church, Edward and Katherine sat at their kitchen table discussing possibilities. Edward had learned from Yates that there was a small homestead available about 5 miles from the Circle J, 150 acres with a modest cabin and good water access. "It would be a start," Edward said, excitement in his voice. "Nothing like Jackson's spread, of course, but enough to build on." "Where would the money come from?" Katherine asked practically. "Starting a ranch requires capital." Edward's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "I have some savings." "Not enough, though. I'd need to continue at the mine while establishing the ranch. It would mean long hours, Katherine, for both of us." "I'm not afraid of work," she said, "but I've also made commitments to the school." "Of course," Edward agreed quickly. "Your work with the children is important." "We'd find a way to balance everything." As they talked through the practicalities, Katherine realized that for the first time in years, they were discussing a future that didn't center around having children. Instead, they were considering new dreams, new possibilities, ones they could build together regardless of her barrenness. Over the following weeks, a new rhythm established itself in their lives. Edward worked his shifts at the mine while investigating the available property and learning all he could about ranching. Katherine divided her time between establishing the school library and making their house truly a home. She also continued writing, filling her journal with stories that she now read to the schoolchildren weekly. Miss Jenkins had convinced the school board to allocate a small budget for books, and Katherine found herself in charge of selecting titles and organizing the collection. Yates Jackson became a regular visitor to their home, often bringing useful information about ranching operations or introducing Edward to experienced hands who could offer advice. Sometimes he arrived with practical gifts, a book on animal husbandry, seeds for Catherine's newly established garden, or once, a filly he claimed was too spirited for ranch work but might make a fine lady's mount. Katherine found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that sometimes troubled her. There was something about Yates's steady presence, his quiet wisdom, that called to something deep within her. She told herself it was merely appreciation for his kindness and guidance, but in honest moments, usually late at night while Edward slept beside her, she acknowledged that her feelings were more complicated. One crisp October afternoon, Katherine was working alone in the schoolhouse, organizing the growing collection of books when Yates appeared in the doorway. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," Katherine replied, setting aside the volume she'd been cataloging. "Edward's still at the mine if you're looking for him. Actually, I came to see you." Yates crossed to the desk where she worked. "Heard about what you're doing here. Impressive." Katherine felt a flush of pleasure at his praise. "It's nothing, really. Just organizing what we have and dreaming about what we need. Dreams matter," Yates said simply, "especially when they're backed by work." He placed a package on the desk. "Brought you something that might help." Inside was a set of beautifully bound children's books, illustrated editions of fairy tales, adventure stories, and nature guides. "Yates," Katherine breathed, "these must have cost a fortune." "Had them shipped from San Francisco," he acknowledged. "My sister's a teacher back in Kentucky." She recommended these titles specifically. "This is incredibly generous," Katherine said, genuinely moved. "The children will be overjoyed." Yates shrugged, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. "Every child deserves stories. They're how we learn about the world beyond our own experience." He paused, then added more quietly, "and sometimes about ourselves." Their eyes met across the desk, and Katherine felt a jolt of connection so powerful it nearly took her breath away. There was understanding in Yates's gaze, understanding, and something more, something that mirrored her own confused feelings. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken words, until the schoolhouse door banged open and several children burst in, eager to see the new library space. The spell broken, Yates tipped his hat to Katherine and took his leave, pausing only to ruffle the hair of a small boy who gazed up at him in admiration. That evening, Katherine found herself unable to focus on her usual tasks. Her mind kept returning to the moment in the schoolhouse, to the look in Yates's eyes. What had he been about to say? What had she wanted him to say? When Edward returned home, he brought news that momentarily displaced her troubled thoughts. "It's done," he announced triumphantly. "I've secured the property, 150 acres, including the cabin and outbuildings." Katherine embraced him, genuinely happy for his excitement. "That's wonderful, Edward. When can we see it?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing. The previous owner has already moved on." Edward's eyes shone with enthusiasm. "It needs work, Katherine, a lot of work, but I can see its potential." The next day dawned bright and cold. Katherine bundled up in her warmest coat as Edward hitched their borrowed wagon. The property lay to the northeast of Wallace, about an hour's journey along increasingly rough roads. As they crested a hill, Edward pointed ahead. "There it is, our future." Katherine followed his gesture and saw a small valley nestled between wooded hills. A crude log cabin stood near its center, with a barn and several smaller outbuildings nearby. A creek glinted in the sunlight as it wound through the property. Drawing closer, Katherine could see that Edward hadn't exaggerated the need for work. The cabin's roof sagged ominously and several windows were broken or missing entirely. The barn looked somewhat sturdier, but its doors hung crookedly on rusted hinges. "It's rather rustic," Katherine said diplomatically. Edward laughed. "It's a shambles," he corrected, "but the bones are good. The land is excellent, and the water rights alone are worth what I paid." They spent the day exploring the property. Despite its dilapidated state, Katherine found herself warming to the place. The setting was beautiful, with mountains visible in every direction and the creek providing a constant gentle music. The cabin, though currently uninhabitable, had possibilities: a central fireplace, surprisingly spacious rooms, and a location that caught both morning and afternoon light. "We could be happy here," she found herself saying as they sat on the wagon for a brief lunch. "We will be happy here," Edward assured her. "It will take time, but we'll build something good, Katherine, something that's ours." As they prepared to depart, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Yates Jackson appeared on his chestnut horse, reining to a stop beside their wagon. "Thought I might find you folks out here," he said. "Edward mentioned you'd be looking at the property today." "What do you think?" Edward asked, gesturing to the homestead. Yates surveyed the scene thoughtfully. "Good water, decent grazing, protected from the worst of the winter winds, needs work of course, but nothing that can't be fixed with time and effort." He nodded approvingly. "You chose well, Edward." "High praise coming from you," Edward replied, clearly pleased. "When will you start the repairs?" Yates asked. "As soon as possible. I need to continue at the mine, of course, but I can work here on my days off." "You'll need help," Yates observed. "That roof won't wait until spring." "I'd planned to hire some men from town," Edward began. "No need for that," Yates interrupted. "My ranch hands and I can get that roof squared away in a day. Consider it a homestead warming gift." Edward protested, but Yates was insistent. "Neighbors help neighbors out here, Edward. That's how we all survive. You'll do the same for someone else when you're established." As autumn deepened toward winter, a new pattern emerged. Edward divided his time between the mine and the homestead, returning to Wallace exhausted but satisfied each evening. Katherine continued her work with the school library while also preparing for their eventual move to the homestead, which Edward had decided to call Rosehill. True to his word, Yates and his men repaired the cabin's roof and reinforced its structure. Katherine accompanied Edward to Rosehill whenever possible, planting a winter garden and working to make the cabin livable. Yates often joined them, bringing tools, supplies, or simply an extra pair of hands. The three of them fell into an easy companionship that puzzled Katherine even as she cherished it. There was something uniquely balanced about their interactions: Edward's enthusiastic energy, Yates's steady practicality, and her own thoughtful creativity, somehow complementing each other perfectly. One Sunday in late November, Edward was called unexpectedly to the mine to address a mechanical failure. Katherine, who had planned to accompany him to Rosehill that day, found herself at loose ends. "You should still go," Edward suggested as he prepared to leave. "The garden needs attending, and I had planned to finish the shelving in the main room. No reason you can't do that in my absence." "Alone?" Katherine asked, surprised. Women in Wallace rarely traveled the outlying roads unaccompanied. "I could ask Jackson to ride out with you," Edward offered. "He mentioned he'd be in town today." Katherine agreed, though the prospect of spending the day alone with Yates both excited and unnerved her. Edward located him at the mercantile and made the arrangements before hurrying off to the mine. The journey to Rosehill was initially quiet, with Katherine acutely aware of Yates riding beside the wagon. Finally, she broke the silence. "You've done so much for us, Yates. I'm not sure how we can ever repay your kindness." "No repayment necessary," he replied. "I admire what you and Edward are building." "It's mostly Edward's vision," Katherine said. "I'm just supporting him." Yates glanced at her. "That's not how I see it. You're partners in this endeavor. Your contributions are different but equally valuable." At Rosehill, they worked side by side throughout the day. Yates completed the shelving Edward had begun while Katherine tended her garden and prepared a simple meal from supplies they'd brought. They ate at the rough table Edward had constructed, sunlight streaming through the newly repaired windows. "It's really taking shape," Yates observed, looking around the cabin's main room. "By spring, you'll be ready to move in permanently." "That's the plan," Katherine agreed. "Though I'll miss certain aspects of town life. Such as the school, primarily, the children," she sighed. "It's a long journey from here." "But not impossible," Yates pointed out. "Especially once you have your own horse. That filly I gave you will be ready for riding by spring." Katherine smiled at his practical solution. "You always see possibilities where I see obstacles. It's easier to see them in someone else's life than your own sometimes," Yates replied, his expression thoughtful. "We all have blind spots." "What are yours?" Katherine asked impulsively. Yates considered the question seriously. "I suppose I've been so focused on building the ranch that I've neglected other aspects of life. Connection, family." He met her eyes. "The things that give the work meaning beyond itself." There it was again, that current of understanding between them, powerful and undeniable. Katherine looked away first, rising to clear their plates. "We should head back before dark." On the return journey to Wallace, snow began to fall gentle at first, then with increasing intensity. By the time they reached town, a full winter storm had developed, with wind driving the snow into drifts and visibility reduced to mere yards. "You shouldn't try to ride back to Circle J in this," Katherine said as they stopped outside her house. "It's too dangerous." Yates nodded agreement. "I'll take a room at the hotel." "Nonsense," Katherine insisted. "We have a perfectly good spare bedroom. Edward would insist if he were here." The mention of Edward's name hung between them, a reminder of boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But the storm was worsening by the minute and practical considerations won out. Inside, Katherine built up the fire while Yates saw to his horse. When he returned, snow coating his hat and shoulders, she had hot coffee waiting. They sat before the fire, talking of inconsequential matters as the storm raged outside. Eventually, the conversation turned to more personal topics. Yates spoke of his childhood in Kentucky, of coming west as a young man full of dreams and ambition. Katherine shared stories of her life in Pennsylvania, her early marriage to Edward, and eventually, the long years of trying for children. "It consumed us," she admitted. "Every month became a cycle of hope and despair. Doctors, treatments, special diets, we tried everything. And when the final verdict came in Denver," she shook her head, "I felt utterly worthless." "You could never be worthless, Katherine," Yates said, his voice low and intense. "Your value isn't determined by your ability to bear children." "I know that now," she said softly. "Or at least, I'm learning to know it. My work with the school has shown me that there are many ways to nurture and guide children, even if they're not my own." "You've found your purpose," Yates observed. "I'm finding it," Katherine corrected. "It's a journey, not a destination." They fell silent, watching the fire's dancing flames. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the house, but inside, there was only warmth and a growing understanding that transcended words. When Edward returned home late that night, covered in snow and exhaustion, he found them still sitting by the fire, talking quietly. If he was surprised to find Yates there, he didn't show it, merely expressed gratitude that Katherine hadn't been alone during the storm. "You'll stay the night, of course," Edward told Yates, as if the decision had already been made. No sense risking the journey to Circle J in this weather. Later, lying beside Edward in their bedroom while Yates slept down the hall, Katherine confronted the complicated feelings stirring within her. She loved Edward had loved him since they were both young and full of simple dreams. But what she felt for Yates was something different yet equally powerful. Not a replacement for her love for Edward, but somehow an extension of it, as if her heart had expanded to encompass both men in different but complementary ways. The thought should have troubled her more than it did. Instead, she found herself drifting to sleep with a curious sense of rightness, as if disparate pieces of her life were finally aligning into a pattern she couldn't yet discern, but somehow trusted. Winter settled over the Idaho territory with a vengeance. Heavy snows made travel difficult, and Edward's trips to Rose Hill became less frequent. The mine continued operations despite the weather, and Edward often returned home so exhausted he could barely eat before falling into bed. Katherine divided her time between her work at the school and preparing for their eventual move to the homestead. She sewed curtains, pieced quilts, and collected kitchen implements and furniture that would make the cabin a home. Yates visited whenever he could make the journey from Circle J, sometimes staying in town for several days to conduct business. He always made time to call on the Roses, often bringing practical gifts or news from the outlying ranches. One evening in January, as a particularly fierce blizzard enveloped Wallace, Edward returned home earlier than expected. His face was grave as he stamped snow from his boots. "What's happened?" Katherine asked, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Cave in at the lower level," Edward replied, accepting the hot coffee she offered. "No one was hurt, thankfully, but it's reminded me how precarious mining work can be." "You're thinking of Rose Hill," Katherine guessed. Edward nodded. "I've been speaking with Sullivan. He's agreed to release me from my contract at the end of February, with a bonus sufficient to purchase initial livestock for the ranch." "February," Katherine repeated, surprised. "That's sooner than we planned." "Spring will be upon us before we know it," Edward said. "If we're to have any chance of establishing a viable operation this year, we need to be on the property full-time by March." Katherine considered the implications. "The cabin is barely habitable, Edward. And what about my work with the school? The cabin is sound if rustic. We can continue improvements as we live there." Edward took her hand. "As for the school, you've established the library beautifully. Perhaps you could ride in once or twice a week to continue your work." It was a reasonable suggestion, but Katherine felt a pang at the thought of leaving Wallace just as she'd found her place within the community. Still, she had always known Rose Hill was their ultimate destination. "Of course," she agreed. "We'll make it work." The following week, Yates arrived in Wallace with news of his own. He had purchased an additional 1,000 acres adjoining his existing property, extending Circle J's boundaries closer to Rose Hill. "The cattle market is strong," he explained over supper at the Roses' home. "And with the railroad spur coming to Wallace next year, transport costs will decrease significantly." "That's fortunate timing," Edward commented. "We've accelerated our timeline for moving to Rose Hill. I'll be leaving the mine at the end of February." Yates raised his eyebrows. "That is accelerated. You'll need help getting established quickly." "We were counting on it," Edward admitted with a smile. "Your expertise has been invaluable thus far." As the men discussed livestock acquisition and spring planting strategies, Katherine found herself studying them both. Edward, with his earnest enthusiasm and quick intelligence, complemented by Yates's measured experience and practical wisdom. They worked well together, each filling gaps in the other's knowledge or approach. In that moment, A possibility crystallized in Catherine's mind, one so unexpected yet somehow so right that it took her breath away. But it was too soon, too tenuous a thought to voice aloud. Instead, she tucked it away, letting it germinate like a seed in fertile soil. February brought alternating patterns of thaw and freeze that made travel treacherous, but allowed more consistent work at Rosehill. Katherine and Edward spent every available moment at the homestead, preparing for their permanent move. Yates continued to assist whenever possible, sometimes bringing ranch hands to help with larger projects. One particularly mild afternoon, as Edward and two of Yates's men worked on reinforcing the barn, Katherine and Yates planted early vegetables in the garden she had established. "You have a gift for growing things," Yates observed as Katherine carefully set onion sets into the rich soil. "My mother taught me," Katherine replied. "She always said a garden was an act of faith, believing in a future you couldn't yet see." "Wise woman," Yates commented. "That's the essence of ranching too, and parenting, I imagine." Katherine's hands stilled in the earth. "Yes, I suppose it is." Yates seemed to realize his misstep. "Katherine, I didn't mean, it's all right," she assured him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said months ago. About hope not being about having children, but finding meaning in the life you have." "And have you found meaning?" Katherine looked up at him, squinting against the winter sun. "I'm beginning to. My work with the school has given me purpose. This homestead gives Edward and me a future to build together." She hesitated, then added softly, "And your friendship has brought something to both our lives that I never expected but now can't imagine being without." Yates held her gaze for a long moment. "The feeling is mutual, Katherine. For both of you." Before either could say more, Edward called from the barn, needing assistance with a beam. The moment passed, but Katherine carried the echo of Yates's words with her throughout the day. That evening, as they prepared to return to Wallace, Edward made an unexpected suggestion. "Yates, Katherine and I have been discussing the challenges of managing Rosehill in these early months. We could use an experienced hand, someone who knows ranching and this territory." Yates leaned against the wagon, waiting for Edward to continue. "What would you think of a partnership?" Edward proposed. "You'd retain Circle J, of course, but we could operate Rosehill as a joint venture, share resources, labor, expertise." Katherine watched Yates carefully, her heart beating faster than it should. This wasn't exactly what she had been thinking, but it was moving in a similar direction. "It's an interesting proposition," Yates said thoughtfully. "Circle J could benefit from expanded operations, and I've always believed this valley could support more substantial ranching than it currently does." He glanced at Katherine. "But such an arrangement would mean frequent interaction between our households, almost like family." "We would welcome that," Katherine said quietly. Edward nodded agreement. "You've become important to us, Yates, to both of us." Something unspoken passed between the three of them, an acknowledgement of bonds that had formed, of feelings that defied simple categorization. Yates straightened, his decision apparently made. "I'll need to review the specifics, but in principle, yes. I'm interested in such a partnership." The days leading up to their move passed in a flurry of activity. Katherine gave notice at the school, arranging to continue her library work on a reduced schedule. She packed their belongings, said farewell to neighbors in Wallace, and tried to prepare herself for the isolation of rural life. On their final evening in town, Edward surprised her with visitors Miss Jenkins, and several of Katherine's students came bearing a parting gift, a handmade quilt featuring squares decorated by each child. "So you'll remember us," a small girl named Eliza explained earnestly. "And come back to tell us stories." Katherine knelt to embrace the child, tears threatening. "I will always come back," she promised. "The library still needs me after all." After the visitors departed, Edward held Katherine as she wept quietly. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," she assured him, wiping her eyes. "Just realizing how much has changed since we arrived in Wallace. I came here feeling broken and purposeless. Now I'm leaving with new dreams and connections I never imagined." Edward kissed her forehead. "Life has a way of surprising us. I came seeking silver and found a calling in the land instead." The next morning dawned clear and cold. As they loaded the last of their belongings onto the wagon, Yates arrived on horseback. "Thought I'd ride alongside you to Rosehill," he explained. "Brought a housewarming gift." From his saddlebag, he produced a wooden sign carved with the name Rosehill in elegant lettering. "For the entrance to the property," he said. "Every home should announce itself properly." Katherine traced the letters with her fingers, touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful, Yates. Thank you." The journey to Rosehill took most of the morning. As they approached the property, Katherine felt a mixture of trepidation and excitement. This was truly a new beginning for her, for Edward, and perhaps for Yates as well. The cabin looked welcoming in the midday sun, smoke already rising from the chimney where one of Yates's men had been sent ahead to start fires and prepare for their arrival. Near the barn, several horses grazed in a newly fenced corral, another of Yates's contributions to their start. As Edward helped Katherine down from the wagon, Yates dismounted and joined them, the three of them standing together looking at the homestead. "Welcome home," Yates said simply. The first weeks at Rosehill were challenging. Despite their preparations, the reality of homestead life proved demanding in ways Katherine hadn't anticipated. Water had to be hauled from the creek, the stove was temperamental, and the nights were still bitterly cold despite the approaching spring. Yet there were compensations. The sunrise over the eastern hills turned the valley into a painting each morning. Birds she had never seen in Wallace visited her growing garden. And there was a deep satisfaction in creating order and beauty in this remote place, in transforming a neglected homestead into a home. Edward threw himself into the work with boundless energy, rising before dawn each day to tend to the small herd of cattle and horses they had acquired. With Yates's guidance, he was learning quickly, his natural intelligence compensating for his lack of experience. Yates himself became a constant presence at Rosehill. Though he maintained his residence at Circle J, he often stayed at the homestead for days at a time, sleeping in the barn's loft or occasionally on a pallet by the cabin's fireplace when weather made travel inadvisable. The three of them settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Edward and Yates worked together during daylight hours, expanding fencing, repairing outbuildings, and tending livestock. Katherine managed the household, expanded her garden, and rode to Wallace once a week to continue her library work. In the evenings, they gathered around the fireplace, sharing meals and conversation that ranged from practical matters to philosophical discussions. Katherine found herself looking forward to these times more than any other part of her day, the comfortable companionship, the overlapping voices, the sense of building something meaningful together. One evening in early April, as they sat before the fire after supper, Edward broached a subject that had been increasingly on all their minds. "This partnership is working well," he began, glancing from Katherine to Yates. "But the current arrangement has its inefficiencies." Yates riding back and forth between properties, dividing his attention and energy. Katherine felt her pulse quicken. Was Edward thinking along the same lines she had been? "What are you suggesting?" Yates asked cautiously. Edward set aside his coffee cup. "I'm suggesting we consider a more permanent arrangement. Circle J is thriving under your foreman's day-to-day management. Rosehill needs your expertise more directly. Why not make your residence here, at least for the majority of the time? Yates was silent for a long moment. That would be unconventional. This entire situation is unconventional, Edward pointed out. A former miner turning rancher, a schoolteacher establishing a homestead library, an experienced rancher taking on partners with no background in the business. He smiled slightly. We've never been conventional people, any of us. Katherine watched the interplay between the men, hardly daring to breathe. There was something happening here that went beyond practical arrangements, something none of them had yet put into words but all seemed to understand. Katherine, Yates said finally, turning to her. Your thoughts on this matter? She met his gaze steadily. I think Edward's suggestion has merit, from a practical standpoint certainly, and from a personal one. She paused, gathering courage. Your presence here has become essential to us, Yates. To both of us. The words hung in the air, laden with meaning beyond their surface. Yates looked from Katherine to Edward, seeming to search for confirmation of what he thought he was hearing. Edward reached across the space between them, placing his hand on Yates's arm. We're asking you to join our family, Yates, in whatever way makes sense to the three of us. Understanding dawned in Yates's eyes, understanding, and a hope so raw it was almost painful to witness. Are you certain? He asked quietly. Both of you. We've discussed it extensively, Edward assured him. This isn't a hasty proposal. Katherine moved to sit beside Yates, taking his hand in hers. When I first arrived in Wallace, I believed my purpose in life was ended because I couldn't have children. You were the one who told me hope isn't about having children, it's about finding meaning in the life you have. She glanced at Edward, who nodded encouragingly. The three of us have found meaning together, Yates, a connection that defies conventional understanding but feels right nonetheless. Yates looked down at their joined hands, then to Edward, who still rested his hand on Yates's arm. I never thought to find this, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Never believed such a thing was possible. Neither did we, Edward said, but here we are. Here we are, Yates repeated softly. Then, with a newfound certainty, yes, my answer is yes. Spring blossomed into summer across the Idaho territory. Rose Hill flourished under the combined efforts of its three caretakers. The garden expanded, the herd grew, and the cabin was gradually transformed with additional rooms and improvements that made it a true home. Yates divided his time between Rose Hill and Circle J, though he spent increasingly more nights at the homestead. A bedroom was added specifically for him, though Katherine and Edward had made it clear that their own door was open to him as well, an invitation Yates accepted with reverent wonder. Their unusual arrangement remained private, a matter between the three of them alone. To the outside world, they presented themselves as business partners and close friends, which was true, if incomplete. Katherine continued her weekly visits to Wallace, maintaining the school library and occasionally teaching. The children adored her stories, especially the new ones she had begun writing, tales of unconventional families finding their way in the western wilderness. One bright July morning, Katherine rose early, slipping quietly from the bed where Edward and Yates still slept. She made coffee and carried it to the porch, watching the sun illuminate the valley that had become her home. So much had changed in the year since she had arrived in Idaho territory. The woman who had stepped off that stagecoach broken by her inability to bear children, uncertain of her purpose, now seemed like a stranger. In her place stood someone who had discovered that family could be defined by love rather than blood. That purpose could be found in unexpected places. And that hope was, indeed, not about having children but about creating meaning in whatever life presented. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find both men joining her on the porch, coffee cups in hand. "Beautiful morning," Edward observed, slipping an arm around her waist. "Beautiful life," Katherine corrected softly. Yates leaned against the porch railing, his face peaceful in the morning light. "I was thinking about that conversation we had nearly a year ago," he said. "About finding purpose in unexpected places." Katherine smiled, remembering. "You were wiser than I knew at the time." "Not wisdom," Yates demurred. "Just hard-won experience. I spent years believing that building Circle J was enough, that the land and the livestock and the work itself could fill all the empty spaces. It wasn't until I met you both that I realized what was missing." "And what was that?" Edward asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. "Connection," Yates replied simply. "The kind that turns a house into a home, the kind that gives the work meaning beyond itself." Katherine reached for his hand, drawing him closer until the three of them stood together, watching the sun rise over their shared life. "Hope isn't about having children," she said, echoing the words that had first opened her heart to new possibilities. "It's about finding meaning in the life you have. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, it's about finding people who help you create that meaning together." Edward smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'd say we've been very fortunate indeed." "More than fortunate," Yates agreed. "Blessed." As they stood together on the porch of Rose Hill, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that he was right. What they had found together, this unconventional family, this shared purpose, this deep and abiding love, was indeed a blessing beyond anything she could have imagined when she first arrived in Wallace, believing her life's purpose had ended. Instead, it had only just begun.